The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across Centennial Olympic Park, transforming the sprawling green space into a canvas of amber and bronze. The temperature had finally dropped from the oppressive Georgia heat that had dominated the week, settling into a comfortable 72 degrees that brought families out of their air-conditioned homes and into the open air. Lieutenant Sarah Collins stood near the edge of the blood drive staging area, her dark blue Atlanta PD uniform crisp despite the hours she had already logged that day. Beside her, K-9 Max sat with his characteristic alertness, his tan and black coat gleaming in the sunlight, his intelligent brown eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced vigilance of a 7-year veteran. The Grady Memorial Hospital community blood drive had drawn an impressive turnout. White tents stretched across the southeastern corner of the park, their canvas sides flapping gently in the breeze. Volunteers in red t-shirts moved between stations, offering cookies and juice to donors who emerged from the mobile collection units looking slightly pale but satisfied with their civic contribution. A local radio station had set up a booth near the entrance, and upbeat music drifted across the grass, mixing with the sound of children playing on the nearby playground. Sarah had not planned to be here today. The appearance had been arranged by the department's Community Relations Office, a chance to showcase the K-9 unit in a positive, non-threatening environment. She had done dozens of these events over the years, standing beside Max while curious citizens approached to ask questions and snap photos. It was good for the department's image, good for community trust, and honestly, she did not mind the break from the intensity of their usual work. Max, however, seemed to have other ideas about how this afternoon would unfold. Sarah first noticed the shift in his posture about 20 minutes after they arrived. His ears, which had been relaxed and swiveling casually to track ambient sounds, suddenly locked forward. His body, which had been loose and approachable for the benefit of the gathering crowd, went rigid. She knew that posture intimately. 7 years of partnership had taught her to read Max like a book written in a language only the two of them understood. She placed a subtle hand on his back, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. Easy, she thought, though she did not speak the word aloud. What do you have, partner? Max's nose twitched, his nostrils flaring as he processed something in the air that Sarah's human senses could not detect. His gaze fixed on a point beyond the main tents, toward the service area where several refrigerated vans were parked. These vehicles were standard for blood drives, equipped with specialized cooling systems to preserve collected donations until they could be transported to processing facilities. A young woman approached with her phone raised, clearly hoping for a photo with the handsome Malinois. Sarah smiled apologetically and shook her head. Sorry, he's in work mode right now, maybe in a few minutes. The woman looked confused but nodded and retreated. Sarah kept her hand on Max's back, feeling the slight tremor that ran through him. He was trying to maintain his training, to wait for her command. But every instinct in his body was screaming at him to investigate. Sarah trusted those instincts with her life. She had seen Max detect threats that no technology could identify, had watched him save lives by following scents that existed only as invisible trails in the air. If something had captured his attention this completely, it warranted investigation. She reached for the radio clipped to her shoulder. Dispatch, this is Unit K-9-7. I am at Centennial Olympic Park for the community event. Going to do a quick perimeter check. Nothing urgent, just following up on something. Copy that. K-9-7. Let us know if you need anything. Sarah unclipped Max's leash from the short lead she used for public appearances and switched to his working lead, a longer line that gave him more freedom to move while maintaining their connection. The shift was subtle, but Max understood it immediately. His tail dropped from its casual position to a focused horizontal line. His breathing changed, becoming deeper and more controlled. He was no longer a community ambassador. He was a working police dog. Heel, Sarah said quietly. and they moved together through the crowd, navigating around families and volunteers with practiced ease. To the casual observer, they appeared to be simply walking through the event. But Sarah could feel the purpose in every step Max took, the way he pulled ever so slightly toward the service area, his nose working constantly. The refrigerated vans were parked in a rough semicircle behind the main tents, their engines idling to maintain the cold temperatures required for blood storage. Hospital workers in scrubs moved between the vehicles and the collection tents, carrying coolers marked with biohazard symbols and the Grady Memorial logo. Everything appeared normal, professional, exactly what you would expect from a major hospital's mobile blood collection operation. Max led her to the third van in the line, a white vehicle with the Grady Memorial logo on its side and Georgia plates. He stopped at the rear doors, his body going absolutely still except for his nose, which continued to work the air with increasing intensity. Then he sat, his eyes fixed on the door handle, and looked back at Sarah with an expression she knew all too well. That was his indication. Something behind those doors had triggered his training, had registered as a scent he was programmed to alert on. The question was what? Max was cross-trained for narcotics, explosives, and human detection. A blood drive should not trigger any of those categories. Sarah studied the van for a moment, noting the details. The vehicle appeared identical to the others, but she noticed that its engine was running slightly louder, as if the cooling system was working harder. The license plate was smudged with road grime, making the numbers difficult to read. And unlike the other vans, which had workers moving freely in and out, this one had remained closed since she started watching. She approached a nearby worker, a young man in scrubs who was loading a cooler into a different van. "Excuse me, who is responsible for that vehicle?" The worker glanced over his shoulder, then shrugged. "Not sure. I think it is from one of the partner clinics. Grady contracts out some of the collection and transport to private services. You would have to ask Dr. Okonkwo. She is the one running things today. Can you point me to her?" The worker gestured toward the largest tent, where a woman in a white coat was reviewing paperwork on a clipboard. Sarah thanked him and headed in that direction, Max padding silently at her side. His attention remained fixed on the van, but he followed her lead without resistance. Trust worked both ways in their partnership. Dr. Okonkwo was a tall woman in her 50s, with close-cropped grey hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up as Sarah approached, her expression shifting from concentration to professional courtesy. "Lieutenant, is everything all right?" Sarah kept her tone casual, conversational, just doing a routine check. "Beautiful event you have organized here, thank you. We have had an excellent turnout. The community has been very generous. I noticed one of the vans in the back," Sarah continued. "The third one from the left. My partner here showed some interest in it. Can you tell me which organization it belongs to?" Dr. Okonkwo's brow furrowed slightly. She flipped through pages on her clipboard, running her finger down a list. "That would be the Vitality Medical Services van. They are a private blood banking company we partner with for overflow during large events like this. Have you worked with them before?" "This is our first collaboration, actually. They reached out about 3 months ago, offered very competitive rates for collection and transport. With budget constraints being what they are, we were happy to have the help." Sarah nodded, filing away the information. "And who from their organization is here today?" Dr. Okonkwo looked around the staging area. "I believe their coordinator is a man named Patterson, Gerald Patterson. I saw him earlier near their van, but I'm not sure where he went." Something cold settled in Sarah's stomach. She had learned long ago to pay attention to that feeling. "Can you describe him?" "Tall, maybe 6'2", sandy hair, mid-40s. He had a badge that said Regional Coordinator." "Thank you, Doctor. I am sure it is nothing, but I would like to take a closer look at that vehicle." "Would you have any objection?" Dr. Okonkwo hesitated, and Sarah saw something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps. Or concern? Of course not. But shouldn't you contact Vitality first? I would hate to cause a problem with one of our partners over nothing. I understand. I will be discreet. Sarah walked back toward the van with Max, her mind sorting through the available information. A new partner organization, a coordinator who had disappeared, a vehicle that had triggered her dog's alert. None of it was conclusive, but together it formed a pattern that her instincts refused to ignore. She was about 10 feet from the van when a man stepped around from the far side of the vehicle. Tall, sandy hair, mid-40s, exactly as Dr. Okonkwo had described. He wore a white polo shirt with a company logo and carried a tablet computer. His smile was immediate and professional, but his eyes went straight to Max before rising to meet Sarah's gaze. "Officer, can I help you with something?" "Lieutenant," Sarah corrected mildly. "Lieutenant Collins. And this is K-9 Max. We are doing a routine security sweep of the event, just checking in with all the service vehicles." The man's smile did not waver, but Sarah noticed his weight shift slightly backward, putting an extra few inches between himself and Max. "Of course, I am Gerald Patterson, Regional Coordinator for Vitality Medical Services. We are proud to support this community event." "How long has Vitality been in operation, Mr. Patterson?" "We were founded 18 months ago. We specialize in rare blood type banking and distribution. There is a real need in the medical community for reliable access to less common blood types, and we saw an opportunity to fill that gap." The answer came too smoothly, too rehearsed. Sarah had conducted enough interviews to recognize the difference between genuine response and prepared script. That is admirable work. "Would you mind if I took a quick look inside your van? Standard procedure for events like this." Patterson's smile finally cracked just slightly. "I would love to accommodate you, Lieutenant, but we have strict protocols about chain of custody for blood products. Opening the storage units without proper authorization could compromise the integrity of the donations." "I am sure you understand." Sarah did understand. She also understood that Patterson's explanation, while reasonable on its surface, was designed to create a barrier, and she understood that Max had not relaxed 1 degree since they approached. If anything, his intensity had increased. "Mr. Patterson, my dog is trained to detect a variety of substances and conditions. When he indicates on a vehicle like he did with yours, I take it seriously. Now, I can contact my supervisor and begin the process of obtaining a warrant, which will take time and create exactly the kind of attention I suspect you would prefer to avoid. Or you can voluntarily allow me to inspect the vehicle. We can clear up whatever triggered my dog's alert, and everyone can get back to their day. Your choice." Patterson stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working slightly. Sarah could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of options and outcomes. Finally, he let out a small laugh and shook his head. "You know what? You are right. I am being overly cautious. Let me open it up for you. I'm sure it is nothing." He moved to the rear doors and produced a key from his pocket. Sarah positioned herself at an angle that gave her a clear view of both Patterson and the van's interior, her hand resting casually near her service weapon. Max pressed close to her leg, every muscle coiled. The doors swung open, releasing a wave of refrigerated air that carried the metallic scent of preserved blood. The interior was lined with industrial shelving, each shelf holding rows of coolers and storage containers. Everything was labeled and organized, exactly what you would expect from a legitimate medical transport operation. "As you can see," Patterson said, gesturing broadly, "everything is standard. Coolers, storage units, temperature monitors, nothing unusual." Sarah stepped closer, examining the labels on the nearest containers. They bore the Grady Memorial logo and standard blood type designations. A positive, B negative, O positive. But something was off. The labels looked right, but the containers beneath them did not quite match the standard hospital-issue coolers she had seen workers loading into the other vans. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward one of the containers. Patterson's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Please, go ahead." Sarah lifted the lid of the nearest cooler, expecting to see the familiar sight of blood bags packed in ice. What she found instead made her breath catch. The blood bags were there, but they were different. Smaller than standard, with labels that bore codes she did not recognize. And attached to each bag was a secondary tag, handwritten in cramped script. She picked up one of the bags, angling it toward the light filtering through the van's doors. The handwritten tag contained a string of numbers and a name, Margaret Chen. Below the name was a date from 3 months ago and a notation that read RH null verified. Sarah did not know much about blood types beyond the basics, but she knew enough to recognize that RH null was exceptionally rare, sometimes called golden blood because of its value to the medical community. She also knew that Margaret Chen was a name she had seen before. It took her a moment to place it. Then the memory surfaced, and the cold feeling in her stomach turned to ice. Margaret Chen had been a billing specialist at Grady Memorial Hospital. 6 months ago, she had filed an internal complaint alleging irregularities in the hospital's blood banking records. 2 weeks after filing that complaint, she had disappeared. The case had been assigned to missing persons, and Sarah had seen the bulletins, but it had not been her investigation until now. "Mr. Patterson," Sarah said slowly, "where did this blood come from?" Patterson's professional mask finally crumbled. He lunged for the van door, trying to slam it closed, but Max was faster. The Malinois launched himself forward with a snarl, catching Patterson's arm and driving him backward onto the asphalt. Sarah drew her weapon in a single fluid motion, training it on the fallen man while Max held him pinned. "Do not move," she commanded. "Dispatch, this is Unit K-9-7. I need immediate backup at Centennial Olympic Park, service area behind the blood drive tents. 1 suspect in custody. This is now a crime scene." Patterson writhed beneath Max's weight, his face contorted with pain and fury. "You do not understand," he gasped. "You have no idea what you're getting into. They will destroy you. They will destroy everything you care about." "Who is they?" Patterson laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "You think I am the one running this? I am nothing. A courier. The people behind this, they have connections everywhere. Police, hospitals, City Hall. You cannot stop them." Sarah kept her weapon trained on him, her free hand reaching down to touch Max's shoulder in the signal that meant hold, but do not escalate. "Watch me." The next 30 minutes were a blur of arriving units, crime scene tape, and the organized chaos of an investigation spinning up from nothing. Patrol officers secured the perimeter, while Sarah coordinated with dispatch to get detectives and forensic specialists en route. The blood drive was shut down, much to the confusion and frustration of the volunteers and donors who had no idea what was happening. Dr. Okonkwo stood at the edge of the tape, her face ashen. "Lieutenant, please! What is going on? What did you find?" Sarah hesitated. The investigation was just beginning, and she had no obligation to share details with a civilian. But something in the doctor's expression suggested genuine shock, not complicity. "Dr. Okonkwo, I need to ask you some questions, not as a suspect, but as someone who might have information that could help us understand what we are dealing with." "Of course, anything." "When Vitality Medical Services approached you about the partnership, who specifically made contact? It was all through official channels. Their business development director sent a proposal to our procurement office, a woman named Reeves, I think, Christina Reeves, and you personally vetted the organization." Dr. Okonkwo's expression shifted to something like shame. I reviewed their credentials, their licensing, their certifications, everything checked out, but I admit I was under pressure from administration to reduce costs. The partnership seemed like a gift. I should have looked more closely. Do not blame yourself. These people are professionals at deception, but I need you to get me copies of every document related to Vitality, every communication, every contract. Can you do that? I will have them within the hour. Sarah nodded and turned back to the scene, where forensic technicians were beginning to photograph and catalogue the contents of the van. Detective Marcus Webb arrived, his broad frame parting the crowd of officers like a ship through water. He was one of the department's senior investigators, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for methodical, relentless casework. "Collins," he said by way of greeting, "what do we have?" Sarah briefed him quickly, walking him through the sequence of events from Max's initial alert to Patterson's arrest. Webb listened without interruption, his dark eyes absorbing every detail. "So this Vitality outfit," he said when she finished. "They have been collecting blood under a legitimate hospital's umbrella and diverting it somewhere else. That is what it looks like. But there is more." She handed him an evidence bag containing the blood bag she had examined, the one with Margaret Chen's name on the tag. This woman disappeared 6 months ago after filing a complaint about irregularities in Grady's blood banking system. Webb's eyebrows rose. "You think there is a connection? I think it is too much of a coincidence to ignore. We need to pull everything on the Chen case. See where the investigation stalled. Already on it." He pulled out his phone and began texting instructions to someone at the precinct. "What about Patterson? Has he said anything useful? He claims to be just a courier, says the real operation is run by people with connections throughout the city. Police, hospitals, government, they always say that when they get caught, trying to make themselves seem more valuable. Maybe, but the look in his eyes when he said it, I believed him. He was scared, Marcus. Not of us. Of whoever he works for." The forensic team worked through the evening as the sun sank below Atlanta's skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that gradually faded to deep blue. Portable lights were set up around the van, casting harsh shadows across the scene. Max stayed close to Sarah throughout, his alert posture never wavering even as the hours stretched on. By 8 o'clock, they had catalogued over 200 blood bags from the van, each with the same unusual labeling system. Most bore identification codes and names that meant nothing to Sarah, but the forensic team had already begun cross-referencing them against missing persons databases and hospital records. The preliminary findings were disturbing. "Lieutenant," one of the technicians called out, "you need to see this." Sarah approached the van, where the technician was pointing at a section of the interior wall. At first glance, it appeared to be standard insulation, but the technician had peeled back a corner to reveal a hidden compartment. Behind the wall was a laptop computer and several external hard drives, along with stacks of paper documents secured with rubber bands. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she recognized what they had found. "This is their records," she said. "Everything they have been doing." The technician nodded. "Looks like it. We will need to get the electronics to the cyber unit for proper analysis, but I did a quick check on one of the drives. Lieutenant, there are thousands of files here. Patient records, financial transactions, shipping manifests. This is a major operation." Sarah stared at the hidden cache, her mind racing through the implications. If Patterson was telling the truth about the scope of this conspiracy, then what they had stumbled onto was just the tip of an iceberg that extended far beneath the surface of Atlanta's institutions. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Webb. "Patterson is asking to talk, says he wants to make a deal." She found Webb in a mobile command unit that had been set up at the edge of the scene. Patterson sat handcuffed at a small table, his earlier bravado completely deflated. The man who had laughed about her inability to stop the conspiracy now looked like someone who had aged 10 years in 3 hours. "Mr. Patterson," Sarah said, taking a seat across from him. "I hear you want to talk." "I want protection," he said immediately. "Full witness protection for me and my family. Immunity from prosecution. In exchange, I will tell you everything. That is not how this works. You do not get to dictate terms after being caught red-handed." "You do not understand," Patterson insisted, leaning forward as far as his cuffs would allow. "These people, they do not just ruin careers. They make people disappear. Margaret Chen was not the first, and she will not be the last. If they find out I am talking to you, I am dead. My wife is dead. My children are dead." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was raw terror, the kind that could not be faked. "Tell me something useful," she said. "Give me a reason to believe you are worth protecting." Patterson swallowed hard. "The blood, the rare types, they are being sold on a black market. Not for transfusions, at least not primarily. There are research applications, pharmaceutical uses, things I do not fully understand. What I do know is that Vitality is just one node in a network that stretches across the Southeast. There are similar operations in Birmingham, Nashville, Charlotte, all feeding into the same distribution system. Who runs it? I do not know the top, I really do not. But my contact, the person who recruited me, she is a hospital administrator. Her name is Victoria Ashford." Sarah felt the name land like a physical blow. Victoria Ashford was the Chief Administrative Officer of Grady Memorial Hospital, one of the most respected healthcare executives in Georgia. She sat on the boards of multiple charitable organizations and had been featured in local media countless times as a champion of accessible healthcare. "You are saying Victoria Ashford is involved in this?" "Not just involved, she built it. She designed the whole system, figured out how to use legitimate hospital operations as cover for the illegal collection and distribution. Every partner clinic, every mobile blood drive, every community outreach program, they all serve the same purpose, creating access to donors who never realize their blood is being diverted." Detective Webb let out a low whistle. "If this is true, we are talking about a massive criminal enterprise operating in plain sight." "It is true," Patterson said desperately, "and I can prove it. There are recordings, documents, digital trails. Ashford is careful, but she is not perfect. I kept insurance." "Where?" Patterson hesitated, and Sarah could see him calculating whether to give up his last bargaining chip. "A storage unit," he finally said. "Decatur. Unit 417 at the secure store facility on Church Street. Everything is there." Sarah exchanged a look with Webb. They both knew they were at a critical juncture. If Patterson was telling the truth, they had an opportunity to blow open a conspiracy that could implicate some of Atlanta's most powerful figures. If he was lying or exaggerating to save his own skin, they could end up wasting resources and making enemies they could not afford. "We need to verify this," Sarah said. "If what you say checks out, we will talk about protection. Until then, you stay in custody." They took precautions that Patterson's lawyer would later describe as excessive, but that Sarah considered barely adequate. Patterson was transferred to a secure holding facility under an assumed booking name. His arrest record flagged as sealed pending investigation. The storage unit in Decatur was placed under surveillance rather than immediately raided, giving them time to obtain a proper warrant and plan an approach that would not tip off anyone who might be watching. Sarah finally left the scene at midnight, her eyes burning with fatigue, but her mind too wired to consider sleep. Max walked beside her to the unmarked department vehicle she had been assigned for the duration of the investigation, his own exhaustion evident in the slight droop of his ears. She opened the back door for him, and he jumped in with less than his usual grace, settling immediately onto the blanket she kept there for him. "Good boy," she murmured, reaching in to scratch behind his ears. "You cracked this one wide open, you know that?" Max's tail thumped weakly against the seat, and he let out a soft whine that might have been acknowledgement or might have been a request for food. Probably both. She drove through the quiet streets of Atlanta, the city's nighttime skyline glittering against the darkness. Her thoughts kept returning to Margaret Chen, the woman whose name on a blood bag had triggered this entire cascade of discoveries. 6 months missing. The investigation had stalled, categorized as a probable runaway despite the objections of her family. Now Sarah understood why. If Victoria Ashford really did have connections throughout the city's institutions, it would have been easy to ensure that certain investigations went nowhere. Her phone rang as she pulled into the parking garage beneath the precinct. The caller ID showed a blocked number. "Collins," she answered. "Lieutenant." The voice was female, cultured, with the slight drawl of old Atlanta money. "I understand you had an interesting evening at the blood drive." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this? Someone who wants to offer you some friendly advice. Walk away from this investigation. Whatever you think you found, you are wrong. The people you are considering going after, they have resources and reach that you cannot imagine. Your career, your reputation, your partner's future in the department, all of it can disappear with a single phone call. Is that a threat? Consider it a professional courtesy, one public servant to another. You have shown admirable initiative, and it would be a shame to see that initiative destroy you. Take the win you have already achieved. Patterson will be convicted, Vitality will be shut down, and you will be celebrated as a hero. That is more than most officers achieve in a career. And Margaret Chen?" There was a pause on the line. "I do not know anyone by that name, really." Because her name was written on a blood bag in Patterson's van. A woman who filed a complaint about exactly the kind of irregularities we discovered tonight. A woman who disappeared 2 weeks after making that complaint. Another pause, longer this time. "I can see you are not going to take my advice. That is unfortunate, Lieutenant. For everyone involved." The line went dead. Sarah sat in her vehicle for a long moment, staring at the phone in her hand. In the back seat, Max had lifted his head, sensing her tension. His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, and something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement of the path they had committed to and the dangers that lay ahead. She scratched his ears one more time, then stepped out of the car and headed into the precinct. Sleep could wait. There was work to do. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity that tested the limits of Sarah's endurance and the department's resources. The warrant for the Decatur storage unit came through at 6 in the morning, and she led the team that executed it, with Max at her side as always. The unit was exactly where Patterson had said, a climate-controlled space about 10 feet square. Inside, they found 4 filing cabinets packed with documents, a fireproof safe containing external hard drives and USB devices, and a locked metal box that held something Sarah had not expected. Photographs, hundreds of them, showing Victoria Ashford meeting with individuals across a range of settings, restaurant dinners, office conferences, what appeared to be private gatherings at expensive homes. Each photograph was dated and annotated on the back, with names and brief descriptions. Patterson was serious about his insurance, Detective Webb observed, flipping through a stack of photos. Some of these people, I recognize their faces from the news. City council members, hospital executives, a couple of state legislators. If these photos prove what Patterson claims they prove, we are looking at a conspiracy that reaches into every level of Atlanta's power structure. Which means we need to be extremely careful about who we trust, Sarah replied. If Ashford really does have connections in the department, any leak could compromise the entire investigation. They established a small task force limited to officers Sarah personally knew and trusted. Lieutenant James Chen from Financial Crimes was brought in to analyze the fiscal documents. Sergeant Diana Reyes from Cybercrimes took point on the digital evidence. Detective Webb coordinated the physical investigation and witness interviews. And Sarah, with Max as her constant companion, served as the lead, the focal point around which all the disparate elements of the case revolved. The first break came from an unexpected direction. Lieutenant Chen, poring over financial records from the storage unit, discovered a pattern of payments flowing through a shell company called Meridian Health Solutions. The company had no physical presence, no employees on record, and no apparent business activities beyond receiving wire transfers from Vitality Medical Services and several other entities, then distributing those funds to a web of accounts across the Caribbean. Classic money laundering structure, Chen explained, pointing at a diagram he had constructed on a whiteboard. Vitality collects the blood, sells it through black market channels, and the proceeds get cleaned through Meridian before being distributed to the principals. What is interesting is where the money goes after Meridian. Look at this. He circled a series of account numbers. These accounts are held by a trust called the Ashford Family Foundation, ostensibly a charitable organization focused on healthcare access. In reality, it appears to be Victoria Ashford's personal piggy bank. Can we prove she controls the foundation? Chen nodded. The documents from the storage unit include trust instruments naming her as the sole trustee with complete discretionary authority over distributions. She has been moving money out of the foundation and into personal accounts for at least 3 years. That is embezzlement, at minimum, Sarah said. Combined with the evidence of the blood trafficking scheme, we are building a serious case. But we still do not have direct evidence linking her to the actual criminal operation, Webb pointed out. Patterson's testimony helps, but a defense attorney will tear him apart. He is a court criminal trying to save himself by pointing fingers. What about the photographs? Circumstantial. She could claim she was simply networking, meeting with community leaders as part of her official duties. We need something more concrete. Sergeant Reyes looked up from her laptop, where she had been analyzing data from the recovered hard drives. I might have something. She turned the screen toward the group. These drives contain years of email correspondence, but it is all encrypted. I've been working on breaking the encryption, and I just cracked the first batch. She pulled up an email chain dated 18 months earlier. The sender was identified only by a code name, Cardinal, but the content was unmistakable. Cardinal was discussing the logistics of establishing a new blood collection front in Nashville, referencing specific hospitals and administrators who could be recruited. The recipient was identified as Phoenix. Do we know who Phoenix is? Sarah asked. Reyes nodded, her expression grim. Cross-referencing with the documents Patterson provided, Phoenix is the codename for Victoria Ashford. These emails are her direct communications about building and expanding the criminal network. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They had found the smoking gun, direct evidence of Ashford's central role in the conspiracy. But they had also opened a door onto something much larger than a single corrupt administrator. Nashville, Birmingham, Charlotte, Sarah murmured, remembering what Patterson had told her. This is not just an Atlanta operation. It is regional, maybe bigger, which means we need to coordinate with federal authorities, Webb said. This has crossed state lines, FBI jurisdiction. Sarah hesitated. The FBI had resources and reach that local police could not match, but bringing in federal partners also meant losing control of the investigation. And there was still the matter of the anonymous caller's warning, the suggestion that Ashford's connections extended into law enforcement itself. Not yet, she decided. We keep building the case locally until we have enough to guarantee federal interest. If we go to the Bureau with half-baked evidence and a conspiracy theory about corruption in Atlanta's institutions, we will be dismissed as paranoid local cops. We need an airtight package." They worked through the night and into the following day, piecing together the evidence into a coherent narrative. The picture that emerged was both impressive in its scope and horrifying in its implications. Victoria Ashford had spent over a decade building her criminal empire, starting with small-scale diversions of blood products that could be written off as administrative errors. As her confidence grew, so did the operation, expanding to include dedicated collection fronts like Vitality Medical Services and partnerships with corrupt administrators at hospitals across the Southeast. The blood itself was sold through black market channels to research facilities, pharmaceutical companies, and private clinics that did not ask questions about sourcing. Rare blood types commanded premium prices, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars per unit, but the most disturbing element of the conspiracy was not the blood itself. It was what happened to those who discovered the truth. Margaret Chen had been one of several hospital employees who had noticed irregularities and tried to report them. Of the 7 names they had identified, 4 had disappeared under circumstances that were never adequately explained. 2 had died in apparent accidents that, upon closer examination, showed signs of professional execution. Only 1 had survived, a former IT specialist who had been fired from Grady Memorial after filing a harassment complaint and now lived in Phoenix under an assumed name. "They are killing witnesses," Sarah said flatly. Staring at the timeline they had constructed, "Anyone who gets too close to the truth, which means you are on their list now," Webb replied. "You and everyone on this task force." Sarah thought about the anonymous phone call, the cultured voice offering professional courtesy before making threats. She thought about Max, sleeping in the corner of the conference room they had converted into a war room, and wondered if the people who had killed Margaret Chen and the others would hesitate to harm a police dog. "We accelerate the timeline," she said. "Whatever we have, we package it tonight. Tomorrow morning I want arrest warrants for Victoria Ashford and every co-conspirator we can identify. We hit them all simultaneously before they have a chance to run or destroy evidence." The preparation for the raids was meticulous. Sarah divided the task force into teams, assigning each to a specific target. Ashford herself would be arrested at her home in Buckhead, a Georgian mansion that had been featured in architectural magazines. Her primary lieutenants, identified through the encrypted emails and Patterson's testimony, would be taken simultaneously at their homes and offices across the metro area. Max would accompany Sarah for the primary arrest. She had considered leaving him at the precinct for safety, but the thought lasted only a moment. They were partners. Where she went, he went. That was how it had always been, and that was how it would remain. At 4 a.m, she loaded Max into the department SUV and joined the convoy of vehicles heading north toward Buckhead. The streets were empty, the city wrapped in the pre-dawn darkness that felt like the world holding its breath. Sarah checked her weapon, confirmed her radio was functional, and reached back to scratch Max behind the ears. "Ready, partner?" Max's tail thumped against the seat, and he let out a soft bark that she interpreted as a scent. The convoy pulled onto the tree-lined street where Ashford's mansion stood behind wrought-iron gates and manicured hedges. Everything was quiet, the house dark, except for a single light burning in a second-floor window. Sarah keyed her radio. "All teams, check in." One by one, the team leaders confirmed they were in position at their respective targets. When the last acknowledgement came through, Sarah took a deep breath. Execute. The gates to Ashford's property were breached within seconds, the locks no match for the portable ram the tactical unit carried. Sarah's vehicle followed the lead units up the curved driveway, coming to a stop at the base of the marble steps that led to the front entrance. She was out before the engine died, Max leaping down beside her, his body taut with focused energy. Police! We have a warrant! The front door splintered under the tactical team's entry, and they flowed into the mansion in a choreographed wave. Sarah and Max followed, her weapon raised and sweeping the elegant foyer as they moved toward the grand staircase. "Upstairs!" someone shouted. "Movement upstairs!" Sarah took the stairs two at a time, Max bounding ahead of her. The second floor was a maze of hallways and doors, but Max knew where to go. His nose had caught a scent, and he was pulling toward a room at the end of the corridor. She kicked the door open to reveal a home office, luxuriously appointed with leather furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Victoria Ashford stood behind the desk, dressed in silk pajamas, her silver hair disheveled from sleep. In her hand was a lighter, its flame dancing in the dim light. On the desk before her was a pile of documents, already beginning to curl and blacken at the edges. "Drop it," Sarah commanded. Ashford looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Sarah expected to see fear or defiance, but what she saw instead was something closer to amusement. "Lieutenant Collins, I warned you." She touched the flame to the documents, and they caught immediately. "Max!" Sarah snapped. "Hold!" The Malinois launched himself across the room, catching Ashford's forearm and driving her away from the desk. The lighter clattered to the floor, and Sarah was there in an instant, stomping out the flames and salvaging what remained of the documents while the tactical team swarmed in to secure the prisoner. "Victoria Ashford," Sarah said, slightly breathless but keeping her voice steady, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and more charges than I have time to list right now. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Ashford laughed as officers pulled her hands behind her back and applied handcuffs. "You think this changes anything? I am just one person. The system I built will continue long after you have forgotten this night." "Maybe," Sarah replied, crouching to examine the partially burned documents, "but you will not be part of it, and neither will the others we are picking up right now." She keyed her radio. "Primary target in custody, all teams, report status." The responses came in rapid succession. Across Metro Atlanta, the task force was executing its warrants, and everywhere the story was the same. Suspects in custody, evidence secured, the network that Victoria Ashford had spent a decade building coming apart in a single coordinated morning. But even as the initial adrenaline faded and the methodical work of processing the crime scenes began, Sarah knew that Ashford's final words held a kernel of truth. They had captured the architect, but the structure she had created extended far beyond what a single night's raids could dismantle. The black market buyers, the corrupt officials in other cities, the money flows that crossed international borders, all of it remained to be unraveled. The investigation would take months, probably years, but for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel a measure of satisfaction. Max sat beside her on the mansion's grand staircase, his tongue lolling in a K-9 grin, and she ran her fingers through the fur at his neck. "Good boy," she murmured. "We got them." Max leaned into her touch, and for a moment, surrounded by the chaos of the ongoing operation, they existed in their own small bubble of peace. The aftermath of the raids dominated Atlanta's news cycle for weeks. Victoria Ashford's arrest was front-page material. Her fall from respected healthcare executive to accused criminal mastermind, capturing the public imagination in ways that even Sarah had not anticipated. Media outlets dug into her background, unearthing a history of professional ruthlessness that, in retrospect, hinted at her capacity for darker deeds. The evidence recovered from the raids and the storage unit proved even more damaging than the task force had hoped. Bank records documented millions of dollars flowing through the shell company network. Communication logs revealed coordination with counterparts in 5 other states, and most damning of all, a series of recorded phone calls, apparently made by Ashford without the knowledge of her conversation partners, implicated senior officials at 3 hospitals and 2 state health agencies. Patterson's testimony bolstered by the documentary evidence, provided the framework that prosecutors needed to bring charges. He was ultimately granted a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, a deal that Sarah accepted with reluctance but understood as necessary. The case against Ashford and her organization was too important to sacrifice on principle. The families of the missing and murdered whistleblowers were notified as the investigation progressed. For some, it brought closure that had seemed impossible. Margaret Chen's sister wept when Sarah called to tell her that they had found evidence of Margaret's fate, that her sister had been a hero who had paid the ultimate price for trying to do the right thing. She knew, the sister said through her tears. She knew something was wrong, and she could not just ignore it. That was who she was. The trial began 8 months after the arrest, in a federal courthouse that reflected the case's escalation to national significance. The FBI had eventually become involved, as Sarah had always known they would, and the prosecution was a joint effort between local and federal authorities. Sarah testified over 3 grueling days, walking the jury through every step of the investigation, from Max's initial alert at the blood drive to the pre-dawn raid on Ashford's mansion. The defense tried to discredit her, suggesting that she had pursued the case as a vehicle for personal advancement, that Max's indication had been fabricated or misinterpreted. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury took less than 6 hours to return guilty verdicts on all major counts. Victoria Ashford was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 years to life, depending on their level of involvement. The network she had built was dismantled, its assets seized, its operatives scattered. On the day the sentence was handed down, Sarah stood on the courthouse steps with Max at her side, facing a bank of cameras and reporters. She answered their questions with the measured professionalism she had developed over years of service, deflecting personal praise and redirecting attention to the task force members who had worked tirelessly to build the case. But when the press conference ended and the reporters dispersed, she allowed herself a moment alone with Max. They walked to a quiet corner of the courthouse plaza, away from the crowds and the noise, and she knelt to meet his eyes. "We did it, partner," she said softly. "All of it. Every piece." Max pressed his nose against her cheek, a gesture of affection that he reserved for moments of genuine emotion between them. His tail wagged slowly, and in his brown eyes she saw something that looked like understanding. The ceremony 3 weeks later was smaller than the press coverage of the trial, but more meaningful to Sarah. In a conference room at the precinct, surrounded by colleagues and commanders, she and Max were presented with the department's Medal of Valor. It was the highest honor the Atlanta Police Department could bestow, and they were only the 3rd human K-9 team in the department's history to receive it. Chief Martinez made the presentation, pinning the medal to Sarah's uniform and attaching a matching insignia to Max's harness. The Malinois sat with perfect discipline throughout the ceremony, but Sarah could feel the slight tremble of his tail against her leg, a private communication that only she could read. "Lieutenant Collins and K-9 Max," the chief said, "represent everything this department strives to be: dedicated, courageous, incorruptible. They followed the evidence wherever it led, regardless of who it implicated or what dangers it posed. Because of their work, a criminal enterprise that had operated for over a decade has been destroyed, and justice has been served for the victims who were silenced." Later, after the handshakes and photographs were finished, Sarah slipped away to the quiet of her office. Max followed, settling into his customary spot beside her desk with a contented sigh. She looked at the medal in its velvet case, then at the dog who had been her partner through everything. "7 years," she said aloud. "7 years we have been doing this together, and I still do not know how I got so lucky." Max raised his head at the sound of her voice, his ears perking forward with interest. She reached down to scratch behind them, feeling the familiar texture of his fur beneath her fingers. The phone on her desk rang, breaking the moment. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but habit won out over sentiment. Collins. Lieutenant, this is dispatch. We have a situation developing at Hartsfield-Jackson. Airport security dog alerted on a cargo shipment. They are requesting K-9 backup. Sarah looked at Max, who had risen to his feet at the shift in her tone. His tail was already wagging, his eyes bright with anticipation. He knew, as he always knew, that the call meant work, purpose, action. "We are on our way," Sarah said. She grabbed her jacket and Max's working harness, and together they headed for the door. The medal could wait. The accolades could wait. What mattered was the work itself, the endless pursuit of justice that gave meaning to everything they did. The drive to the airport was familiar, a route she had traveled dozens of times for similar call-outs. Max sat in his customary position in the back seat, watching the city slide past through the window. The afternoon sun was warm on his fur, and his breathing was slow and steady, conserving energy for whatever lay ahead. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here, from the sunny afternoon at the blood drive to the raids and trials and ceremonies that had followed. She thought about Margaret Chen and the other whistleblowers who had paid with their lives for their courage. She thought about Victoria Ashford, who had built an empire on stolen blood and murdered innocents, and who would spend the rest of her days behind bars because one dog had caught a scent that did not belong. The airport appeared on the horizon, a sprawling complex of terminals and runways that served as the beating heart of Atlanta's connection to the world. Somewhere inside, another mystery waited, another puzzle that only Max could begin to solve. She pulled into the secure area designated for law enforcement vehicles and stepped out into the Georgia heat. Max jumped down beside her, his harness already in place, his body vibrating with controlled excitement. Around them, airport security officers were waiting, their faces showing the mixture of relief and uncertainty that always accompanied a K-9 call-out. "Lieutenant Collins," the lead officer said, stepping forward to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming so quickly. We have a cargo container in the holding area, international shipment from Eastern Europe. Our dog alerted twice, but is not trained for detailed indication. We need someone who can tell us exactly what we are dealing with." Sarah nodded and looked down at Max. His ears were forward, his nose already working the air. Whatever was in that container, he would find it. "Show us the way." They walked into the vast cargo facility together, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Rows of shipping containers stretched into the distance, each one holding its own secrets. Max moved with purpose, his training taking over as they approached the designated container. Sarah watched him work, feeling the familiar pride that came from witnessing excellence in action. Whatever came next, whatever new conspiracy or criminal enterprise or simple smuggling operation awaited them, she knew they would face it together. That was what partners did. The container doors swung open and Max stepped inside, and so it began again. The cargo container was a standard 40-foot unit, its corrugated steel walls showing the wear of countless international journeys. Inside, stacked floor to ceiling, were boxes marked with Cyrillic text and European customs stamps. The air was thick with the smell of industrial packing materials, machine oil, and something else that Sarah could not quite identify, but that clearly had Max's attention. He moved through the narrow aisle between the boxes with measured precision, his nose sampling the air every few inches. Sarah followed, her flashlight cutting through the dim interior as she watched for any sign of danger. Behind them, the airport security team waited at the entrance, their tension palpable. Max paused at a box near the back of the container. His body went rigid, and he looked back at Sarah with the expression she knew so well. This one. She photographed the box's markings and documented its position before carefully slicing through the tape that secured it. The contents were packed in foam padding, and at first glance appeared to be nothing more than industrial equipment, specifically components that might be used in laboratory or medical settings. But Max was not interested in the visible contents. His nose pressed against the foam padding itself, indicating something hidden beneath. Sarah pulled away the padding to reveal a false bottom in the box. Beneath it, carefully packaged in vacuum-sealed bags, were dozens of glass vials filled with a clear liquid. Each vial was labeled with a numerical code and what appeared to be biological hazard warnings in multiple languages. "Get the hazmat team here now," Sarah ordered, stepping back from the box. "And I want the manifest for this entire shipment. Every box, every document, everything." The next 4 hours were a blur of controlled chaos as hazmat specialists in full protective gear catalogued and secured the suspicious vials. Preliminary field testing suggested they contained biological materials, though the exact nature would require laboratory analysis. The shipping manifest identified the cargo as industrial centrifuge parts, destined for a company in Atlanta that, upon investigation, turned out to have no actual physical presence or employees. "Another shell company," Detective Webb said when Sarah briefed him over the phone. "This is starting to feel familiar. Too familiar. I want to know if there is any connection to the Ashford network. You think this could be related? She is in prison, Collins. Her organization is gone. Her organization in Atlanta is gone. But she had connections throughout the Southeast, and we never fully mapped her international contacts. What if this is part of the same larger system, just a different branch?" The investigation that followed was both more complex and more frustrating than the Ashford case. The shell company that had ordered the shipment existed only on paper, its registration tracing back to a law firm in Delaware that specialized in creating untraceable corporate entities. The Cyrillic markings on the boxes pointed to Eastern European origin, but the shipping route had been deliberately convoluted, passing through ports in 6 different countries before reaching Atlanta. Laboratory analysis of the vials revealed their contents to be samples of various rare blood types, preserved using techniques more sophisticated than anything available commercially. The biological hazard warnings were legitimate. Improper handling could release pathogens that had been inadvertently preserved along with the blood. Someone is shipping preserved blood across international borders. Sarah summarized during a task force meeting a week after the airport discovery. Rare types, professionally processed, concealed in industrial cargo. Does this sound familiar to anyone else? Lieutenant Chen pulled up financial records on the conference room's screen. "I have been digging into Meridian Health Solutions, the shell company that handled money for the Ashford operation. Before we shut them down, they had correspondent banking relationships with several European institutions. One of them is headquartered in Romania, where the shipping container originated," Webb added. "Exactly. And here is where it gets interesting. 3 weeks before the container was shipped, there was a wire transfer from an account in Bucharest to a bank in the Cayman Islands. The amount matches the estimated value of the blood samples we recovered." Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing through the implications. "We assumed Ashford's organization was regional, focused on the Southeast. But what if it was just one part of an international operation? What if the people she worked with are still active, just operating from beyond our reach?" "That would explain why she was so confident at her trial," Webb said. "She knew that even with her gone, the bigger machine would keep running." The realization was both energizing and daunting. They had won a significant victory against Ashford and her local network, but that victory was starting to look like a single battle in a much larger war. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of Atlanta's jurisdiction, the real architects of the conspiracy were still operating. "We need federal help," Sarah admitted. "This is bigger than us, bigger than any single city or state." The FBI liaison assigned to the original case was Supervisory Special Agent Patricia Hernandez, a veteran investigator with extensive experience in international criminal enterprises. When Sarah briefed her on the airport discovery and its potential connection to the Ashford case, Hernandez listened with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades separating meaningful patterns from noise. "You may be onto something, Lieutenant," she said, when Sarah finished. "We have been tracking a network of black-market biological material traders operating out of Eastern Europe for several years. Small-scale stuff, nothing that rises to the level of priority. But if what you are describing is accurate, this could be the American distribution arm of something much more significant. Can you share what you have?" Hernandez nodded slowly. "I will need to get authorization, but given your role in bringing down Ashford, I think the Bureau will be receptive. You have credibility, Collins. Use it." The federal intelligence that Hernandez eventually provided painted a disturbing picture. The Eastern European network specialized in biological materials of all kinds, from rare blood types to tissue samples to genetic material. Their clients included legitimate research institutions looking to bypass ethical restrictions, pharmaceutical companies seeking to cut costs, and more sinister actors whose purposes the intelligence could only speculate about. The network's leadership was unknown, hidden behind layers of shell companies and intermediaries. But there were patterns, recurring names and locations that suggested a hub of operations somewhere in Romania, possibly connected to former government officials from the communist era who had transitioned into organized crime after the regime fell. "This is way above my pay grade," Sarah told Max that evening as they sat in her small apartment, case files spread across every available surface. "We are talking about international organized crime, corrupt governments, maybe intelligence agencies. What can one police lieutenant and her dog do against all that?" Max, sprawled on his bed in the corner, raised his head at the sound of her voice. His tail thumped once, and his brown eyes seemed to convey a simple message, the same thing we always do. She smiled despite her exhaustion and reached down to scratch his ears. "You are right. We follow the evidence. We do our job. And we trust that it matters." The break came from an unexpected direction 3 months later. A Romanian journalist named Elena Dragomir reached out to Sarah through the Atlanta Police Department's Public Affairs Office. She had been investigating the biological materials network for years, and the Ashford prosecution had finally given her the confirmation she needed that the American connection existed. "Lieutenant Collins," she said during their first video call, her accented English carrying the weight of someone who had risked everything for her work, "I have documents, recordings, evidence that traces back to the highest levels of the network, but I cannot publish without American corroboration. The people I am investigating, they have killed journalists before. I need protection that only your government can provide." "What do you want in exchange?" "Everything. I want to bring down the entire organization, not just the American branch. I want justice for everyone they have hurt." Sarah thought about the months of investigation, the dead ends and frustrations, the sense that they were fighting an enemy they could barely see. And here was someone offering to illuminate the darkness. "Send me what you have. I cannot make promises, but if your evidence is real, I will do everything in my power to help you." The documents Dragomir sent transformed the investigation. Bank records, corporate registrations, intercepted communications, all painting a comprehensive picture of an organization that had operated in the shadows for over 20 years. At its head was a man named Viktor Kedrov, a former Romanian intelligence officer who had leveraged his government connections into a private empire of corruption and exploitation. Kedrov had built his network slowly and carefully, recruiting doctors, hospital administrators, and government officials across multiple countries. The blood trafficking that Ashford had run in Atlanta was just one branch of an operation that spanned 4 continents. The money generated funded everything from legitimate investments to weapons trafficking, all hidden behind a facade of charitable foundations and healthcare initiatives. "This is it," Agent Hernandez said when she reviewed the documents. "This is enough to justify a major operation. I need to take this up the chain immediately." The operation that followed was codenamed Bloodstone, a coordinated international effort involving the FBI, Interpol, and law enforcement agencies in 12 countries. Sarah was designated as the American liaison, her expertise in the Ashford case making her invaluable in connecting the domestic and international elements of the investigation. She spent the next 6 months traveling between Atlanta, Washington, and various European capitals, always with Max at her side. The Malinois became a minor celebrity among the international law enforcement community, his role in uncovering the conspiracy having been documented in official reports that were shared among participating agencies. The final raid on Kedrov's compound in the Romanian countryside was conducted on a cold November morning, with Sarah watching via satellite link from an operations center in Bucharest. She had wanted to be there in person, but international jurisdictional protocols made that impossible. Instead, she sat with Max beside her, watching the screens as tactical teams from multiple countries converged on the fortified estate. "All teams in position," a voice announced over the command channel. "Execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1, execute." The screens erupted with activity as breaching charges detonated and teams poured into the compound. Sarah held her breath, her hand resting on Max's neck, feeling his tension mirror her own. The operation lasted less than 15 minutes. When it was over, Viktor Kedrov was in custody, along with 17 of his top lieutenants. The compound yielded a treasure trove of evidence, including physical records, digital files, and testimony from employees who'd been waiting for someone to finally hold their employer accountable. Sarah watched as Kedrov was led out of the compound in handcuffs, his face showing the same calm arrogance she'd seen in Victoria Ashford. These people, she thought, never believed they could be touched. They operated above the law for so long that they forgot the law still existed, but it did exist, and sometimes, against all odds, it won. The flight back to Atlanta felt different than the dozens of flights she had taken during the investigation. There was a sense of completion, of a story that had finally reached its end. Max slept in his carrier beside her seat, exhausted from the months of travel and work, his paws twitching occasionally as he dreamed. Sarah looked out the window at the clouds stretching to the horizon and thought about everything that had happened since that afternoon at the blood drive. She thought about Margaret Chen and the other whistleblowers who had paid with their lives. She thought about Elena Dragomir, whose courage had made the international operation possible. She thought about the thousands of victims, donors who had unknowingly contributed to a criminal enterprise, patients who had received black market blood without knowing its origins. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous. And she knew, with the certainty born of experience, that somewhere out there, another criminal enterprise was forming, another conspiracy taking shape. The work was never truly finished, but today, right now, she allowed herself to feel something like satisfaction. They had made a difference. They had followed the evidence wherever it led, had refused to be intimidated or corrupted, had done the job they had sworn to do, and they had done it together. She reached down to touch Max's carrier, feeling the warmth of his sleeping body through the fabric. Partners, from the beginning to the end. The ceremony at Grady Memorial Hospital took place 1 year to the day after the original blood drive where Max had made his fateful indication. The hospital had been thoroughly reformed in the wake of the scandal. With new leadership committed to transparency and accountability, they had requested that Sarah and Max attend the anniversary event, not just as honored guests, but as symbols of the integrity that the institution now aspired to represent. Sarah stood at a podium in the same park where everything had begun, looking out at a crowd that included hospital staff, community members, law enforcement colleagues, and media representatives. Max sat beside her, his posture dignified, his eyes calm. "1 year ago," she said, "my partner and I came to this park for what was supposed to be a routine community appearance. We left with the first pieces of a puzzle that would eventually span continents and bring down one of the largest criminal enterprises in modern history. None of that would have been possible without the work of countless dedicated professionals, from local detectives to international investigators. But it also would not have been possible without the whistleblowers who risked everything to expose the truth. People like Margaret Chen, whose courage cost her her life, but whose legacy lives on in the reforms we celebrate today." She paused, gathering herself for what came next. "When I became a police officer, I took an oath to serve and protect. Over the years, I've come to understand that those words mean more than just responding to emergency calls or making arrests. They mean standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. They mean following the evidence wherever it leads, even when powerful people want you to stop. And they mean never forgetting that at the end of every case file, every investigation, every prosecution, there are real human beings whose lives have been affected." She looked down at Max, and something passed between them in that moment. "My partner has taught me more about dedication and loyalty than any human being ever could. He does not care about politics or promotions or public perception. He cares about doing the job, about finding the truth, about protecting the people who cannot protect themselves. If I have achieved anything worthy of recognition, it is because I have tried to live up to his example." The crowd applauded, and Sarah stepped back from the podium. The hospital presented her with a plaque commemorating the anniversary, and Max received a new collar with a special medallion marking his service. But the real honor, she thought, was simply being here, being alive, being free, being able to continue the work. The blood drive proceeded around them, donors lining up to give the gift of life through channels that were now transparent and accountable. Sarah watched them for a while. These ordinary citizens performing an extraordinary act of generosity, and felt a profound gratitude for the privilege of serving them. "Ready to go home?" she asked Max. The Malinois rose and stretched, his tail wagging gently. He looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen so much, that had guided them both through darkness and danger to this moment of light. Together, they walked away from the park toward whatever came next. The sun was warm on their backs, and the future stretched before them like an open road. There would be other cases, other challenges, other moments when it seemed like the forces of corruption and cruelty were too powerful to overcome. But they would face them the same way they had faced everything else, together, as partners. Sarah reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, and he leaned into her touch with the trust that had defined their partnership from the very beginning. "Good boy," she murmured. "Good boy." And somewhere in the distance, a dog barked in response, as if the entire world was affirming what they both already knew. They were home.